Good evening. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to the Fall Festival of Authors for year 2008. I welcome you on behalf of President Harris Pastides, Provost Mark Becker, and all the faculty, staff, and students at the University of South Carolina. I will introduce myself. I am Christine Curtis. I'm Vice Provost for Faculty Development, and I'm excited to be here tonight. I just told Bill Rivers, the chair of English, that I was going to tell you about a flashback to my last English experience. I'm a chemist by training and chemical engineer by profession. And then I decided that you probably would not be interested, so I will spare you the details. The Fall Festival of Authors is jointly sponsored by the Thomas Cooper Library and the Department of English. And it is supported by a generous anonymous donor. The Fall Festival of Authors brings in world-renowned authors. And remember, I'm a chemist, chemical engineer, and I've only been here less than 2 years, and I don't remember it from last year, but when I came here, I was just amazed at all the art, literary, and theater. I was just overwhelmed by everything that was happening here at the University of South Carolina. I came from a much more technically oriented university, and I just couldn't get it all in. And so I went to the web and kind of looked back at the list of authors who have been here over the last several years, and it's truly amazing. And I just wanted to say how important it is for people like our anonymous donors to give us this wonderful gift. We could not have this type of intellectual enrichment outside of our academic, normal, routine environment without the support and the generosity of this donor and many other donors. The support of our community is also extremely valuable, and we truly value our interactions with our community. I am asked to tell you about what's going to be happening next week for the other two events. There will be on Tuesday, November 18th, a Pulitzer Prize poet, Louise Glick, and that will be right here in the Law School auditorium at 6 p.m. with a book signing following that. And then on November 20th, that's Thursday evening at 6 p.m., there will be the best-selling author David Bejo. So we have quite a week ahead of us. Tonight, we are really especially glad to be here because we have one of our very own, one of our assistant professors at the University of South Carolina who is going to read to us, Dr. David Bejo, who is going to be reading from his book, The 351 Books of Irma. I told you Bill was going to try to say this. 351 Books of Irma Akiri. And I'm told that I haven't read this book, I have to admit yet, but I'm told that the lead character is a mathematician. And I will have to tell you, the books I really like, and they're very few and far between, are the ones where there's a chemist as the lead person. There's been a few movies with chemist as the hero. I just watched them over and over again. But anyway, I'm looking forward to the mathematician since my daughter's a mathematician. But I want to, again, welcome you tonight to the 2008 Fall Festival of Authors. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll be able to come next week as well.
Thank you and welcome. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce the first writer in this year's Fall Festival of Authors, our own David Bejo. As many of you know, David is now in his 4th year of teaching in the English department here at the University of South Carolina. In that time, he has, in his own quiet and thoughtful way, just wowed both his students and his colleagues with his wide-ranging knowledge and his sensitivity and passion when he teaches both literature and creative writing. David grew up in a family of 15 brothers and sisters in San Diego near the U.S.-Mexican border. And I have a feeling this large family has a lot to do with his love of books. I think he's looking for a solitary corner where he can go and hide. But we're glad he found the books. David completed his bachelor's degree at the University of San Diego and then earned an MA in English at the University of Michigan. His MFA is from the University of California, Irvine, where he worked with, among others, Peter Matheson, Richard Ford, P.D. James, and Amy Tan. He's worked as a journalist and an editor, a writer and a translator, and has taught English and writing at the University of California, Irvine, National University in San Diego, and Boise State University. In addition to hundreds of reviews, essays, and translations, he's published a number of creative nonfiction pieces and short stories. And especially notable among those short stories is the piece, The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which was nominated in 2006 for a Pushcart Prize. That's a distinction that's very coveted, but not often received by all writers or serious writers of fiction. David's most recent accomplishment is the publication of his amazing novel, The 351 Books of Irma Akuri, published by Viking in hardback just this past summer. The people at Viking were so thoroughly convinced of the quality and the appeal of the 351 books that they scheduled the paperback edition for appearance in spring of 2009 and authorized translations into, and this is a long list, so bear with me, Italian, Dutch, Spanish, Chinese, both Taiwanese and mainland versions of Chinese, Korean, Portuguese, Hebrew, and Croatian. I had the pleasure of reading the 351 books last spring in a pre-publication copy. That's one of the perks of being his chair. You get to see things early on. I won't attempt to summarize its plot or even begin to chronicle the many fascinating, tantalizing themes that are woven through it. I will say that it is at once and in many different ways one of the most intellectually stimulating and physically present novels I've ever read. The 351 books has been reviewed in the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, the Los Angeles Times, the Morning News, and several others. The review in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune has a nice passage that I would like to read for you because it begins to pull together some of the many things, many attractions in the novel. So I'm quoting, Irma Akuri invokes the metaphysical spirit of authors Bejo clearly admires, Borges, Kundera, Cervantes, to name a few. And it's loaded with intertextual hijinks, doppelgangers, artistic and carnal seduction, and elegant mathematical equations. Think of it as Eastern European beach reading, thinking of another novel. So Eastern European beach reading, a sexy book that's about everything, yet above all about the act or the art of reading itself. For me, the 351 books is above all a novel about books. It's about reading them, it's about collecting them, it's about restoring and preserving books as physical objects, but ultimately it's how the reading and rereading of books can provide us with clues and insights into friends, lovers, and life itself. At its core, it's really a book lover's novel, I think. It's also a very challenging and thoroughly enjoyable puzzle of a novel. But I've said too much. It's time to welcome David as he comes to read and talk with us.
Thank you, Bill. That was wonderful. And thank all of you, really, for coming. I appreciate it. Books drive Don Quixote mad. Or is it the reading of the books that drive him mad? And when we read a book, when do we stop reading it? When does it stop driving us mad, if it ever does? So I'm going to drive you a little bit more mad, assuming that you've read a book or two. So forgive me. I'm going to read from the middle of the book, the 351 books of Irma Curie. And so I'll do a quick setup so you can think that you know what's going on anyway. Philip Masaryk is a mathematician on a quest to find Irma Curie, a bookbinder who has disappeared and bequeathed him a library of 351 books she has restored. In the passage I'm about to read, he's on his way to Madrid, or so he believes, to find her. In order to track her down, he's begun reading the library, the books all new to him. Following his own mathematical formula for exploring collection, he's only just begun the third selection, which is Don Quixote. The other character you need to know about here is Lucia, who's, I guess, one of the doppelgangers mentioned in the review that Bill spoke of. Lucia, a translator who might be in league with Irma. She has helped or maybe hindered Philip read by trying to identify for him where Irma has messed with the books, intruded, overstepped her boundaries as bookbinder and conservator, perhaps as friend, lover. So Philip has brought with him three extra novels, besides the Quixote, which is sort of his self-assigned novel. He's brought with him three novels he's stolen from his own library. He's cheating on his own formula. These three novels are Carol Meso's Eva, Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn. So, here's Philip on the flight to Madrid, armed with the Quixote, trying to fight back. On the overnight to Madrid, he read Quixote. Marcella, the shepherdess whose beauty kills Crisostomo, makes a sudden appearance at the end of the funeral, stepping from the woods and showing herself to be even more beautiful than her legend contends. When the travelers, their eyes clouded for a moment by grief and anger, berate her for the death and misery she has caused, Marcella defends herself with insight that rivals her physical grace. After explaining herself, she returns to the woods, quote, all those present filled with admiration as much for her intelligence as for her beauty, and some, those who were pierced by the powerful arrow of the light in her beautiful eyes, gave indications of wanting to follow her. The chivalrous Quixote, hand on the hilt of his sword, warns everyone to abide by Marcella's wishes to be left alone and threatens to stop anyone who tries to follow. When the travelers go their separate ways, leaving Quixote alone with Sancho, he of course resolves to seek her out and offer to serve her in any way he can. He and Sancho enter the forest and ride after her, quote, having ridden more than 2 hours, looking for her everywhere and not finding her, they decided to stop in a meadow full of new grass where a cool, gentle stream ran, so welcoming that it invited and obliged one to spend the hottest hours of the day there. For the rigors of the afternoon were just beginning. How long would you search, Pip, before stopping? Philip almost continued to read, with only the trailing edge of his consciousness catching Irma's intrusion. A snag in a stream. The book lay open on his seat tray, and he placed his hand on the page. As though caught, he looked around the dimly lit cabin of the plane. Almost all the passengers were sleeping, their snores and breathing blending with the soft engine hum. Pale yellow lights marked those reading their way across the Atlantic. He continued reading, quote, "When I finally go missing from your life, how long will you search? And what will be the starting angle of your search? What will be the curve? How carefully will you draw the formula before you begin? Will you seek help with the equations?" In embarrassment, Philip pushed the folder containing his composition book and equations deeper into the seat pocket behind the flight magazines. Philip cupped his hands on either side of the open Quixote and looked around the plane to see if the eyes of the nearest passengers were closed. He then relaxed his hands and let the book be an open book. "No one cares," Irma once said. "No one reads." He continued with the Cervantes, looking forward to Quixote's story and Irma's too. In the woods, Quixote and Sancho never find the beautiful Marcela. Instead, Quixote's nag, Rocinante, left unhobbled, wanders after a group of mares, seeking a little fun, and gets Quixote and Sancho into a confrontation with angry young Guayasans. Greatly outnumbered, Quixote and Sancho are badly beaten and left for dead, as they often are left by Cervantes. All his skill, quote, "all his skill and courage were of no use to him. I can only guess how much you know, Pip. How much you know now, how much you've known all along. Sometimes you are so bright that I feel lifted around you, carried along by you. Sometimes you seem lost forever in some mathematical fog, weighted, unnecessarily anchored. We don't wonder the same things." He bookmarked Quixote, then reached for his composition book and tore loose a blank page. He filled the grid with answers to her questions, culling the corresponding equations from the proof composed to search for her. Then he translated them as plainly as he could. "How long will I search?" He showed her how you can take Newton's binomial theorem to express equations of various curves as infinite series in the variable x, then apply Fermat's formula x to the power of n plus 1 over n plus 1, as Newton did, to each term of the series. This lets me affect the quadrature of many new curves. But I've learned things beyond what Newton and Fermat first gave us. So that's what you're up against. And if you can't follow all this, if you've grown bored and sleepy from it, then just note the word infinite. What will be my starting angle? That I've shown you already. Draw a logarithmic spiral. Make it pretty as you can. Trace it on your stomach. Spiral it outward as far as you like. Tickle what you want. Draw a y-axis and an x-axis through its center. Measure all the angles formed. Each one, as you know, will measure the same. The curve, this is where I have you. The ellipse, pi times a times b, where a and b are the lengths of the major and minor axes. This I extend from simple geometry, Archimedes' method of exhaustion applied to a parabola. But you are definitely not parabolic. So it's the ellipse. But the key word for your bored and sleepy eyes is exhaustion. We do wonder the same things, he wrote in reply. We wonder them in different ways. Philip almost crumbled the paper, but instead he inserted it neatly into the Quixote, where he had bookmarked his place. He noticed as he continued to read and reread earlier chapters on the plane that she tended to appear most directly in those moments when Quixote lay immobilized by the weight of his armor or the weight of his grandiose decisions, which was often. But she would appear almost anywhere, briefly. And of course, he could not always tell when it was Cervantes and when it was Irma, because he did not know the book. And Cervantes frequently addressed the reader and used that collapsing and retracting point of view. Lucia was there to help him intermittently with her little yellow posts. The book felt alive in his hands, treacherous and seductive, the dimpled leather of its cover a providing skin. As its reader, he was outnumbered at least 3-1. But then, as noted by Lucia, you have to consider, too, all the translators involved, all the transcribers and historians and censors. You are vastly overmatched. But that never seems to stop Q. Love, L. She pasted this note within Quixote's ill-fated battle against the 20 young Guasons. Philip tried to sleep, but only ended up in a more agitated state, his attempts to doze merely awakening surface anxieties, those linked to immediate surroundings. The landscapes in Quixote and the breadth of Irma's ability to predict him combined to make the plane feel small, a tube insulating him from the world he wanted to search, gliding him over the most oft-drawn path across the Atlantic. The only way to catch her trail was to leave such paths as quickly as she did. She left airports faster than anyone he had ever known. Following her from a plane, staying in her slipstream, if you could, was exhilarating. Her main task was to move, to get somewhere, to hop on the next available piece of transport, the most battered taxi, a shuttle bus with destinations painted on its windshield. Ask no questions when the way out is clear. Get yourself to a table in the city, a path to a ruin, a drink in a cantina, a piece of fruit or handmade candy from a vendor. The hours gone and the hours to come on the flight felt useless, wasted, non-retractable somehow. The eyes closed count you take against the tree while all others hide. How fast can you count to 100 while you think about the one you want to find first? There is always that one you want to find first, hide with later in the game. How fast can you count as you imagine her, eyes clenched shut? During the changeover in Heathrow, his anxiety took shape and pulsed. His count started over, this time to 1,000. Just through customs, he encountered walls filled with hundreds of destinations. He found himself skimming down the list to mark those he had been to with her, and then those she had hurried away to without him. Don't look at signs in airports if you don't need to, she told him. Don't ask questions. Don't ask for directions. Go. A single taxi driver out there, she said, pointing, will know more than everybody and everything an airport has to offer. You moving will know more. It was difficult for him to stand, let alone sit in the gate area for his Madrid connection. Over 2 hours wait. He felt the heft of the Quixote, her Quixote, in his shoulder bag, filled with her designs for him and now his plans for her. He began walking the length of the terminal to stretch his legs, to move, to know more. He didn't fear incorrect choices. Mathematicians can't function with that fear. What lay before him was a sea of choices of seemingly equal value, or whose respective values shifted upon consideration. At the rounded tip of the terminal, he came upon what the British called the island flights, all advertised with suggestions of the quick and the cavalier. The flights were cheap and frequent for London, several referred to as hops and getaways, poised at this circling end of the terminal. One of the next available was Corsica. The season hadn't quite begun there. Hurry now. Lucia had visited once, and the idea of going there felt much like one of her little yellow posts stuck into the Cervantes. And two, her finger puzzle, reminding him in all its color and grip to go in to get out. The island was on his list, though much farther down. It stood along the minor axis of the ellipse he had drawn for Irma. The small jet to Corsica had a light, feral look about it as it perched on the tarmac amid the giant airliners. She could be there as well as anywhere. But as he committed himself to the idea of Corsica, he once again sensed that he was acting on something, that understanding before knowing. Something lingered there on the island, just a thought or image or feeling he needed to complete. A quieting of her furtive shoulders was how he imagined it. Something he should have done while there, with her, for her. And it was this image that carried him most toward the island, the rightness of it. In the thrum of the small jet, he recalled Lucia's hands, rendering the island for him in a delicate circle, fingertips aligned, thumbs tip to tip. Whether she was somehow with Irma or not, he would make her his ally in this tangent. She had been to Corte, the island's rocky heart. He easily imagined her moving along its broken paths, its stepped walkways, getting what she needed right away from its buildings, navigating directly to the university library to get the books she needed, perhaps pausing once on the remains of a watchtower to catch sight of a mosque, broken toy-like across a far precipice. In his imagination, her movements, the length of her step, the flicker of her orange dress, her sandals on Roman stones, were all in contrast to his first excursion to the island with Irma, an arduous hike into the stony foothills beyond Ajaccio. They searched for one of the many unnamed crumbling fortifications, trying to stay on a trail that often vanished into thorny scrub, rock juts, or welcome streams. She wasn't even after the books themselves, but their leathers and clasps, which she heard were rendered from a kind of pygmy goat brought by Moors, then exterminated during the Aragon occupation. The almost unbearable heat of their trek was made worse by their constant view of the sea. "We'll swim later," Irma had told him, when she turned to find him resting, watching the water. "I promise." But they didn't swim. Their search failed and left her angry and defiant in defeat. She stared hard at the wake of the ferry that returned them to Sardinia, as though she were making sure their course remained absolutely straight, knifing the sea. Maybe that was another reason for his flight to the island. There he could stand on the ground of one of her few failures, reassure himself that she sometimes miscalculated things, overestimated her perception. Perhaps she would also need to return to correct what she had missed. Pluck Corsica like a book from her library. He closed his eyes and pictured the delicate circle of Lucia's hands again, the pale stretch of her thumbs. "It's an island," she had said, as though that made it harmless. To pass the flight, Philip perused the other books he had taken, avoiding Quixote altogether. They still felt stolen. He wanted to tell Lucia which ones he had taken. Eva, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, The Rings of Saturn. He split the meso in two and read what he estimated was the very center of the book. Quote, "She wants to convey what is barely felt, never verbalized, fleeting, never arrested, common to all, and developing at different states of awareness." He had been thinking of Lucia just before he read the sentence, so by reflex, she became the subject. But who was telling him this? Irma or Meso? Was it a compliment or a warning? He flipped through the novel and was stunned to discover that he would never be able to find out because it was composed of separate sentences, free of their paragraphs and scenes, almost free of each other, as though she had dropped the book like a treasure box and shattered the content, its order. It was full of crystalline phrases, kaleidoscoped together, enclosed in emerald green leather. He switched to the Kundera, someone his parents had tried to tell him about when they deemed him old enough. He must have recognized the title from distant memory when he first chose the book. He rubbed his fingers over the black felt, settled his hand to it. He read the opening, sifting through it for her. He was able to push aside what could easily be her musings on life, on eternal return, on the perversity of a world that rests essentially on the non-existence of return. But he fell across this passage, reading it 3 times, a mere image that immediately became an event for him. But this time he fell asleep by her side. When he woke up the next morning, he found Teresa, who was still asleep, holding his hand. Could they have been hand in hand all night? It was hard to believe. Philip remembered something like this happening once with Irma in a hotel in Pátzcuaro, an old convent across the street from where penitents dragged themselves on their knees over the cobblestones. She claimed she awoke too, like him, hands held. Why is it so unbelievable, she asked later, in the same bed, astride him, her thumbs probing beneath his ears, his breathing pushing against her breasts. In the Sebald, he avoided the words. It looked opposite the meso, somehow, all spaces filled, paragraphs brimming. But it had photos, and he could flip through it and pause on them, as if going through one of the flight magazines. He suspected one photo about 2/3 through. It seemed more in focus than the others. It showed a doorway fronted by stacks of papers and books, bound and unbound, teetering before a room dimly lit by leaded glass windows, a place they had searched together in Prague. Or so he believed. And unlike the other pictures, he couldn't find direct reference to it in the surrounding text, only a description of a pantry. And it was easy for him to see one moment ahead in the photo, when he had emerged from the room to look back for her, then ducked back in to dodge her camera. In the breezeway of the Corsican airport, getting to the first taxi he saw, Philip was broadsided by a hard wind off the Mediterranean. Because he had flung himself farther east than originally planned, his sense of time and light listed. And the wind, which he had forgotten about, dizzied him. He forgot which color taxis were the safest, the quickest. The one he crawled into was burnt orange with sticky black seats and a wet dog smell. The driver, hunched over his wheel, was much too tall for his little car. He appeared distracted, never fully turning to face Philip in greeting, only showing him the jagged brown coastline of his profile. "Ajaccio or Bonifacio?" the driver asked as they reached the coast road. The small but sleek airport left them nowhere. The vowel sound between the 2 destinations was indistinct. Irma had described the language as sounding like French people speaking Spanish using Italian words. Philip didn't answer right away and stared at the Mediterranean, which struck the coast directly here. No beach, no cliffs. The rough waves broke among the rocks and the scrub, looking as though they were flooding the foothills. You could imagine rabbits and lizards running to avoid the encroaching water. On the road to Ajaccio, they passed ancient forts and lookouts that appeared fused to the rocks. It was not unusual for the edifices to jut beyond the edges of the escarpments, an anxiousness toward the sea about them. Philip tried to remember which one marked the trailhead he had taken with Irma. It wasn't that all of them looked strange to him. It was that each looked familiar. He had seen them all before, with her. Here, in his woeful search, she had elbowed aside all attempts to clear her image from his thoughts and senses and stood victorious, hands on hips, waist cocked forward. She had cleared away his visions of Lucia, foiled his attempts to cheat on her library, and tricked him into returning to a place where they had failed together, brought him to a hall of mirrors. Passing the ancient parapets, one after another along the rocky coast, reminded him of how long the ride to Ajaccio was. The taxi felt suffocating with its furry smell, giant driver, and gummy seats. Philip rolled down the seaward window, and the wind tore through a surprisingly chilly force that threw papers across the windshield and had the driver cursing everything in jangly Corsu. A cold sweat of wrongness fingered up Philip's neck. Along one of the smoother inlets near Cap de Freno, where there was some semblance of a little beach and where he could see campers had left fire rings, he had the driver stop. "Please," he said in English, then Spanish, then French, then Italian, finally making the driver laugh. Philip pantomimed the breaststroke, puffing his cheeks. The driver leaned on his taxi and smoked a cigarette as he watched Philip go down to the water for a swim. He seemed uninsulted as Philip hauled his shoulder bag and case with him. Philip found a sandy crook in the steep tumble of rock and scrub and took off his clothes. The wind instantly dried his sweat. He waded into the shallows where the waves were broken and weak. There was a leftover chill to the water, and the sudden drop-off caught him unaware, and he fell into the sea. He meant to swim in order to rinse her away, but when he surfaced, his longing was nearly painful, a kind of swimming cramp low in his gut. More strongly than ever before, he felt her gone, torn away. She should have been there, right now, beside him, laughing at their collective mistake about the water, about how cold it would be, how rough, how perfect it would feel to embrace each other in it, skin as soft as the anemones beneath their feet. He paddled low into the waves, his chin dipped into their salty churn. The water was the kind he had learned to swim in, the cold, rough Pacific. And he let it slap against his face, bring him around a bit. He closed his eyes to the blue sky. He could undo this mistake, retrace the same return they managed the first time, and get back on course. To Madrid. "Fuck this island," Irma told him. "I want to get off it right away. We take the ferry to Sardinia and catch a plane there." He arced into the water, pulling himself deeper into a green darkness. The colder water down there seemed to shear him, peel away a dead layer, the husk drifting behind him like smoke. And in the cool depths, arms rotating for balance, he thought to do one more thing denied him, the other thing besides this swim. He thought to return to Corte, to the home of Irma's friend Marion Haupt, the collector who had first brought them here. On shore, he dried quickly in the wind and let the chill punish him for being impulsive and creative. He dressed, shivered by the salt pinpricks beneath his clothes. The driver took him the rest of the way to Ajaccio, and Philip stared at the dying light over the Mediterranean, the sea turning ink blue under orange light. They drove straight to the station in Ajaccio, and Philip, still moving to no more, was able to catch the last evening train to Corte. The chemin de fer was Irma's favorite rail in the world. With its little cars and narrow-gauge track, it looked like a child's model come to life. But as he boarded, he was sad to see that the old flat-face cars had been replaced with sleek bullet-nosed shuttles, quicker into the foothills and mountain tunnels. Twilight was fading to night as his train climbed into the high mountains. But the car's rapid ascent allowed Philip to gain on the sun a little while longer. You had to convince yourself the train was going somewhere, following something, because the path disappeared into mountain curves, and weeds and wildflowers grew between the narrow rails, and rock faces seemed to clash together, closing off passage. Before all light faded, Philip caught a glimpse of the highest, most distant peaks, and still tipped with snow, and making the island seem as though it had broken from the Alps somewhere and floated into the middle of the Mediterranean. In Corte, he always felt as though he had been taken to the top of the world. At night, the effect was even stronger, as the chasms surrounding the village dropped into blackness and the old walls teetered above streetlights, all crashed together and upward, lifting thoughts just to the crest of dizziness. But the cafes around the main plaza were busy, as though everything were level. Tables shoved out over the stone walks, students and professors having wine in summer clothes, toasting the occasional warm breeze rolling through the cool mountain air. Philip stood in the light of the Paoli statue and tried to catch his breath. No one else in the night crowd seemed to struggle with the thin air and slanted ground. Again, it was easy for him to imagine Lucia here, moving along the tables, taking her pick of what she wanted, who she wanted, her brown shoulders catching the glow of the street lamps, her sandaled feet light on the slant. He wanted to stay where she might have stayed when she was here. With enough time and daylight, he believed he could figure out where. But he was tired and feeling lost again, far away from where he was supposed to be, astray from solving the great need in the world caused by his delay. He took the first inn he found, where the old couple who owned the place insisted in Corsu, then Italian, then Spanish, on first showing him the linoleum floors of his room and the new fiberglass shower in the shared bath. The old man wore a burgundy jacket with yellow epaulets that had several tassels missing. The bed was too short for Philip, and he slept and dreamt in bits through the night, each dream of another place waking him with a jolt, leaving him to wonder where he might be. He read himself back to sleep each time, using the rings of Saturn, going over the same passage about a farmer in Yoxford building a miniature replica of the Temple of Jerusalem in his barn, using a multitude of textual evidence to get the details exact, devoting his final years to the task. The passage is split by the largest photograph in the novel, a 2-page blurring picture of what could be the columned interior of the temple, its miniature replica or the actual one, had it still been in existence. The vaguest figure of a man stands dwarfed by the columns. You don't see him right away. Philip's longest stretch of sleep was filled by a dream walk among the columns, himself the miniature, flickering man trying not to disappear. Cuidado, Lucia whispers above him, her voice as big and quiet as the sky, hushing the word into an invite instead of a warning. Thank you. Thank you. I do have time to take questions if you have them.
Have you explored the Mediterranean yourself?
Oh, yes.
Does it draw from your experience?
It does. Yeah. How much, I'm not going to say. You'd have to buy me a drink. Yes, Nina.
Could you talk a little bit about how the various literary texts maybe work their way into this, or turn that into a question that you would want to answer? I mean, I was struck just at the end about the Seabold and that building, that city within the barn, which seems to reflect how...
That picture, I mean, it was fun to go to dip into my library and pull out books. And I could almost do it at random as I was writing it. But not, I mean, something in my hard mind made me lift out the rings of Saturn. And I did literally open it and see what pictures there were. And the largest picture, it is a picture in the actual book. It's not one of Irma's photographs. But I mean, it was perfect because of the little blurry man and the whole idea of the temple and Sebald's, the way he uses photos. It was the most enjoyable part of the book. It was, a lot of it was done in revision, where I knew I had to mess around and dip into her library more to make the book more of the book that I wanted it to be. So, I mean, there are books that aren't so literary. I mean, the one of the more fun ones I had was a book called Carmody Tough Bullet by a writer named Peter McCurtain. And then there was a book way back when I was a kid that my mother bought for me, trying to get me out of her hair on some family trip. And I think I was 7 or something. And she just grabbed this 45-cent paperback at a 7-Eleven and, here, read this, thinking it was just this Western, like a the Zane Grey Western, but it wasn't. It was full of, it's set in a bordello in New Orleans, and I learned all kinds of stuff at the age of 7 in that book. And and that book is in here because I just had to put that one in here. And it exists, and it's out there, and I would love to find an original copy. And so with that book, instead of going too much into the prose, which isn't really, I love the cover. And so I described the cover on the paperback, which had the whore from the bordello in New Orleans. Her name was Minnie Ha Ha. 2 words, Minnie Ha Ha. And we were wearing this see-through gossamer thing, with the shadows in just the right places. I could go on. There are a lot of references to books, but yes.
What is it like revising a book like this? How do you keep it under control through the revision process? Did you try to keep it under control?
I did try to keep it under control, and that is a very insightful question. She wanted to know how you revise a book like this, how you keep it under control. And yes, I could have gone crazy with the books, and I would have loved to, but when you revise, maybe the second, third time, you do keep the reader in mind. I know that sounds sacrilegious maybe to some writers, but it becomes, it becomes somewhat mechanical at that point. I don't want to take the fun out of it, but you keep it under control by thinking of the reader. I mean, the reader is, reading is an art. And it's kind of what this book is about, the art of reading. So I think maybe my answer is I become more of a reader than a writer to keep it under control. It gets out of control, though. Yes?
In your acknowledgments, you credit any life found in these pages, I think, Elise Blackwell. So, taking the excerpt you just read us as an example, where is Elise?
Where's the life?
Because I know the carriage is looking for Irma. Where will we find Elise?
She's at home babysitting right now. You're going to have to buy me a drink, too, Kevin. Autobiography, where is it? You've probably heard me say this. Autobiography, I say this a lot, and I mean it sincerely. It's like breathing. If you're not aware of it, you're using it. If you are aware of it, you're using it and feeling it. And, you really want to know where Elise Blackwell is at. Other question? Yes.
Dave, I'd like to ask you the Brian Lamb type question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you write? How long did it take you to conceive and write this book? How long has this been in your imagination? How many drafts do you do? And let me finish up with that wonderful Brian Lamb question. Do you use a computer or do you just write out by hand? And you do not have to buy me a drink to answer these questions.
No, I don't. And I'm not the one buying the drinks, by the way. backwards. You got it backwards. When a book for me starts with a startling image. And the image that startled me into writing this book took place in the labyrinths beneath the Princeton Library, the Firestone Library, where they have an incredible collection that you could imagine, much like the one here. It's another amazing library, rare books. And beneath that are the book conservators. And I was fortunate just to live across the street from the main book conservator at the Firestone Library, Mick Latorno, incredible craftsman. But I was under there, he was going to give me this tour, and I was in his lab, and he was gone, and I was where I wasn't supposed to be, which is a great place for a writer to be. I love transgression. It's, I recommend it. Well, maybe I'm not supposed to. Just don't take anything. And I was down there, and there was his main desk, his main lab, and then there was another desk where his apprentice worked, I could tell. And she was gone too, and I knew it was a she, or I'm pretty sure it was a she, because her coffee cup had lipstick on it, and there was a little silver bracelet. And her tools, the wonderful tools that book conservators use, were there. And there was a broken book and a kind of a ruler over it. And it seemed, I would just remember the light coming down, a winter Princeton light sifting down into the basement, and that empty lab. And it seemed as though she had just sort of ascended into the rare books section right above her. I mean, she had gone to the restroom or gone to get some more coffee, but, and it starts to gestate there. And I knew I wanted to write a book right then about a book conservator, a woman who had done that somehow. And I thought, how can I make her disappear? And I began taking notes, and I began doing research without people knowing that I was doing research. Like, I asked the book conservator lots of questions, and went on lots of tours through the places I wasn't supposed to be. And I didn't touch a computer for a year, I would say, just taking notes. But yeah, I mean, once I start writing, I use a computer. Did I answer your question? Yes?
How did the mechanics and mathematical equations, how easy was that to work into this book? Because I know you have a love of art and literature, but the equations to me are difficult to interpret and understand on the surface, but they work really well here. Was that a struggle, or is that a knowledge that you had?
Yeah, I mean, that's the illusion, the art of the illusion of it. I do love math. I love reading math books. Eli Mayor, have you ever read any of his? He's a wonderful mathematician, a real mathematician at the University of Chicago. He writes things such as the story of E. But that's all illusion. I mean, I learned to do that because I translated a book of material science for Princeton University Press, and I translated it from Spanish. I didn't even know what material science was. But whenever I got to the math, all I had to do, I didn't know it. It was very high math. And I just called my editor, who was a physicist, and I cut and pasted it. He told me how to cut and paste it. So I wrote this, or I translated this book. I also did one on the, it's a book that's in here, and both of the books are actually in here, of another physicist in Spain who tracked down the actual Star of Bethlehem. Great book, if you ever want to read it. Fascinating, full of math, and you don't have to be a mathematician. But anyway, I learned that there were these gaps that I could translate over and then just put in the math. And it looks like, it looks like the translator of that book knew the math. So I got the idea, well, I could do the same thing here. Sorry to disappoint you again. Writers, I mean, one thing you could do, one advantage, maybe the only advantage of a novelist is, I mean, you can make yourself look a lot smarter than you really are. That's what it's all about. Oh, yes.
I have a question, building on the process question, which is having been startled by the image of the, apotheosis in the book conservative. How much can you let yourself think about why you're writing about that, or how much can you theorize your own impulse, and how do you stop yourself from doing it too much?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the control question. I don't think about the why. I think that can interfere with the story. However, I need to know that there's an answer to the why. Does that make sense? And it's a constant fight to deflect that through the whole process, through every revision. I mean, I'm answering for myself. Kind of a practical way I do it is, this is going to sound kitschy, I guess, but I carefully choose the music I listen to. It kind of, I'm one of those people who I need a few distractions to work, and so I carefully let the music kind of take care of that thought process. I really do. And I mean, I think it out. But don't ask me what the music is. Some of it filters into this, actually. Did I answer your question?
We'll follow up to that question. Why did you choose Philip to sort of be who he is and what he is as your protagonist in the story? I mean, you may not know why, but...
Part of it is I wanted somebody who was a little bit like me, because self-expression is, fuel for a novel, but I wanted someone with distance from me, and I also needed somebody who was clearly intelligent, but who just hadn't read books, not math books. So I wanted somebody who's this sort of combination of naive but savant in some way. I came to the mathematician pretty fast. I knew I had a book conservator and a mathematician, like bookends, and I also knew that I loved reading about math, and I knew that I would have to do research, and that you want to pick research that you enjoy. I think all of us do. Yes?
That's what I was going to ask you. And that's my husband, by the way, and he read it this summer, and he read a lot of it to me. We had a great summer. We also asked you the same question in class, and she turned the color of that shield behind your head, basically.
Silver?
Well,
that's her right there.
Yeah. But I guess my question was, did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy writing this book?
Well, enjoy is just not deep enough of a word. Yeah, on one level I did enjoy it, but it was something that I needed. You feel that it's a delusion, probably. I talk about that a lot. You delude yourself into this, you convince yourself, and it is a delusion, I think, that you need to write this book. And that's how it felt. It felt like fulfilling a really deep need. So yeah, that's enjoyable. It's a lot more than that, but yeah. Thank you again for for coming. This was wonderful, and